Executive Summary. Between 2018 and 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, OVW, distributed more than $3.7 billion in grants to U.S. states and territories, including Washington, D.C., to address domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, rape, and stalking. Nearly one-third, about $1.1 billion, was awarded through the STOP, Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors Violence Against Women Act, VAWA formula grant program. Under STOP, each state must allocate 25% of funds to law enforcement and 25% to prosecution to strengthen training, accountability, and victim services. Despite this investment, No Peace, No Quiet found that 94% of states are not in full compliance with the grant requirements. The National Domestic Violence Hotline's 2022 Law Enforcement Experience Report found that among survivors who called police, 39% felt less safe afterward, 40% felt no difference, and only 20% felt safer. No Peace, No Quiet's research shows a pattern of systemic failures. For example, officers refusing to take reports, misclassifying sexual assaults as lesser incidents, and inconsistent reporting through NIBRS and UCR systems. And a Spark study found that of roughly 30,800 stalking-related calls for service, none resulted in a formal stalking report or arrest. It was discovered through our research that 88% of states lack mandatory law enforcement training on stalking. According to other reports, 76% of women murdered by an intimate partner were stalked in the year before their deaths, and 54% had reported stalking to police before being killed. Not only is this gap a violation of the STOP Grants program formula, but it also shows law enforcement's failure to recognize stalking as coercive control and a red flag for lethal violence, leaving victims and survivors without protection, and abusers exploit systemic blind spots. These findings reveal serious oversight gaps that distort DOJ crime statistics and weaken public trust in how STOP funds are being used. States must ensure the outcomes promised to Congress and the public are met through measurable training and accountability. In 2022, No Peace, No Quiet joined 437 nonprofit organizations within the National Task Force to end sexual and domestic violence in supporting the reauthorization of VAWA. We will continue to support this critical legislation, while calling on states to improve monitoring and transparency to guarantee that federal funds achieve sustainable and real safety that prioritizes victim-focused outcome legislation and results. 2. How this research supports our mission. Social bias continues to shape how survivors are treated, influencing credibility, outcomes, and access to protection. These same biases are amplified online, where abusers weaponize social media to discredit and re-victimize survivors. This was detailed in our publications, The Contradiction of Social Bias in Abuse Cases, When Standing Up Leads to Punishment, and the disturbing trend, abusers filing defamation lawsuits in response to domestic violence reports. This cycle of bias and digital harassment reinforces systemic failures and highlights the need for strict oversight and transparent reporting of OVW-funded programs. Federal funds were intended to strengthen law enforcement training, prosecution, and victim services. Without accountability, survivors remain vulnerable to inadequate protection and uneven justice. Through this research, No Peace, No Quiet advances its mission to fight social bias and create safe spaces, both online and offline, for victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, and stalking. Our work connects digital harassment, social bias, and training deficiencies to ensure survivors are heard and protected wherever justice should prevail. 3. OVW Funding Overview. Since 1995, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, OVW, has awarded over $11 billion in grants to states and territories to combat violence against women. Between 2018 and 2024, $3.7 billion was distributed to strengthen victim services, justice responses, and law enforcement training on domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Key OVW grant programs include UP Formula Grant Program, Improving Criminal Grant Program, Improving Criminal Justice Responses ICJR Program, Rural Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking Program. Grants to encourage arrest policies and enforcement of protection orders. The focus of No Peace, No Quiet's research is the STOP Formula Grant Program. Under this program, states are required to dedicate 25% of their funds to law enforcement training and 25% to prosecution. This formula, in place since 1995, ensures that a substantial portion of federal funding supports training and tools for law enforcement and prosecutors handling crimes of violence against women. Survivors' safety often depends on the knowledge and response of first responders. The intent of OVW funding is to enhance victim safety, strengthen accountability for offenders, and ensure every level of the justice system can effectively respond. Despite billions of dollars in investment, major gaps remain in mandatory law enforcement training, resulting in inconsistent, non-trauma-informed responses that leave survivors vulnerable to underreporting, misclassification, and inequitable access to justice. 4. The disconnect. A 2023 review of state statutes and police training requirements found that more than half of states do not require mandatory training for law enforcement on domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. This lack of consistency results in uneven protection for survivors across jurisdictions, missed opportunities to prevent repeat violence, poor coordination with victim services and the legal system, undermining of federal investments and legislative intent. Reasons for this disconnect include lack of political will and leadership, misalignment between grant applications and legislative mandates, weak oversight of how OVW funds are spent, no clear accountability metrics tied to outcomes. When officers are untrained, they often misinterpret survivor behavior, minimize danger, or fail to identify patterns of coercive control, allowing abusers to manipulate gaps in the system and escape accountability. This creates a justice imbalance that tips the scale in the perpetrator's favor. 5. Training gaps by state. No Peace, No Quiet's Phase 1 research reviewed every state's law enforcement training program and found deeply concerning trends. The numbers show how far states have strayed from the original intent of the STOP grant formula. Visual maps of all 50 states show the following. 94% of states are not in full compliance with the STOP-VAWA grant program for domestic violence, sexual assault and rape, and stalking training for law enforcement. Only three states, California, Oklahoma, and Virginia, show marginal compliance with mandatory basic training for law enforcement in all three categories. 3 states, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, and Texas, only have mandatory law enforcement training for child sexual assault and rape. Child sexual assault and rape CSA only training shown in striped color. The effectiveness of the programs that are in place is unknown. No Peace, No Quiet has filed a FOIA request to obtain each state's progress reports that were submitted to OVA between 2018 and 2024. Tennessee also has DV mandatory initial training, but it is limited. 38% of states have limited to no training for all three areas of concern: domestic violence, sexual assault and rape, and stalking. Child sexual assault and rape CSA only training shown in striped color. Domestic violence training for law enforcement. Only 26 states have mandatory initial training. Out of those 26 states, only 12 states have mandatory continuing education training. Sexual assault and rape training for law enforcement. Only 24 states have mandatory initial training. Out of those 24 states, only 14 states have mandatory continuing education training. And 3 of those states, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Texas, only cover child sexual assault CSA training. Stalking training for law enforcement. Only 6 states have mandatory initial training. Out of those 6 states, only 4 states have mandatory continuing education stalking training. 6. Supporting research. The additional research we have highlighted in this white paper together support our central claim. Billions in federal STOP funding have not translated into measurable, consistent improvements in law enforcement response. The data exposes a broken feedback loop where untrained officers, flawed reporting practices, and lack of oversight continue to endanger survivors and erode trust in the justice system. Law Enforcement Experience Report, 2022. This report from the National Domestic Violence Hotline reveals how survivors experience law enforcement, conducted with about 1,500 respondents, revealing significant concerns about police involvement in domestic violence cases. Key findings. 92% of those who never called police said they feared the response. 75% feared being blamed or disbelieved. 39% of those who called felt less safe afterward. 40% said it made no difference. Only 20% felt safer. 71% said they would have preferred other resources if available. Why it matters highlights why oversight of STOP funding is crucial. Supports our mission to create safe spaces for survivors. Shows the need for community-based alternatives and independent crisis response models. Stalking is a leading indicator of predictable violence case studies and reports. there is credible evidence and expert commentary in the U.S. suggesting that stalking, especially by former or current intimate partners, is under-recognized, underreported, or even de-emphasized by law enforcement. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics 2022, 61% of stalking victims are targeted by a current or former intimate partner, compared to 13% by strangers. Stalking is one of the strongest indicators of potential homicide. Key findings: 76% of women murdered by an intimate partner were stalked in the year before their deaths. 54% had reported stalking to police before being killed. McFarlane et al., American Journal of Public Health, 1999, NYC Mayor's Office, 2018. Over $11 billion in VAWA funding since 1995 has not produced consistent training outcomes. 88% of states lack mandatory stalking training for police. Why it matters: stalking is a major red flag for lethal violence. Ignoring it violates the STOP grant intent. Training on stalking must be required for all law enforcement to prevent predictable murders. Without standardized training, officers often dismiss stalking as harassment or domestic disputes, minimizing early warning signs and leaving victims unprotected. Officer-involved domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking case studies and reports. Nearly 3 decades after the Violence Against Women Act (VAWA) was enacted in 1995, research and case evidence reveal a recurring pattern. Officers who commit domestic or sexual violence are rarely held accountable, often remain armed, and frequently avoid prosecution. Key findings: studies show 5 to 40% of police families experience domestic violence, averaging about 21%. Johnson et al., Journal of Family Violence, 2005. Between 2005 to 2007, 324 U.S. officers were arrested for domestic violence-related crimes. Only 35% were terminated. Stinson and Liederbach, Police Integrity Lost, 2016. DOJ's 2024 review confirmed continuing sexual violence and internal victimization among officers, often without firearm restrictions. Why it matters: survivors are told to trust law enforcement, but when the abuser wears the badge, every systemic gap, training, oversight, or lack of discipline becomes a threat to public safety. You can't reform a culture that protects its own abusers by handing it with more training funds. Real accountability means separating response from self-interest and building survivor-centered units that enforce the law evenly, no matter who wears the badge. Underreporting and misclassification in DV, SA, and stalking reports. Accurate reporting by law enforcement is essential to understanding the full scope of gender-based violence and evaluating the effectiveness of federally funded programs, such as the STOP Formula Grant Program, administered by U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, OVW. Yet law enforcement often refuses or downgrades reports. Key findings: DOJ's Identifying and Preventing Gender Bias in Law Enforcement 2015 found disbelief and minimization are still common. Unfounded Sexual Assault, Women's Experiences, PMC 2022, confirmed that many victims were turned away, removing crimes from official data. Spohn et al. Nige, 2012, found 10.9% of rape cases in Los Angeles were wrongly marked unfounded. D.C. and Philadelphia investigations revealed large-scale misclassification that required federal oversight. DOJ and Urban Institute audits have documented inconsistent data reporting among STOP recipients for years. Why it matters: every unfiled or downgraded report denies victims justice. Inaccurate data masks failures and misdirects funding. Accountability and independent audits must be part of every STOP program. 7. Recommendations to close the gaps. Advocates: track state compliance with STOP mandates and publish data showing training deficiencies. Collaborate with survivors to evaluate law enforcement response and identify unmet needs. Promote public education on stalking, officer-involved violence, and reporting failures. Advocate for alternative response models, such as survivor-centered crisis teams and non-police interventions. Allies, state agencies, law enforcement, and NGOs require trauma-informed, survivor-centered training for law enforcement with continuing education. Establish independent divisions for investigating domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Implement third-party audits of unfounded or downgraded reports. Enforce firearm restrictions for officers facing domestic violence allegations. Legislators: tie STOP-VAWA funding to measurable compliance and performance outcomes. mandate statewide training standards on domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, require full participation in neighbors and transparent reporting of case outcomes, create public tracking systems for officer-involved domestic violence and misconduct, expand VAWA funding eligibility to support trauma-informed, community-based alternatives that strengthen survivor safety outside traditional law enforcement responses. 8. Conclusion. The allocation of more than $11 billion in federal funds reflects a national commitment to ending violence against women. Yet, without enforceable state-level mandates for law enforcement training, these funds fall short of transforming practice. Closing the training gaps in non-compliant states is essential to improving justice responses, protecting survivors, and honoring the intent of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. Without accountability, the justice system continues to favor perpetrators over survivors. Lack of law enforcement training and proper oversight feeds bias and misclassification tilt outcomes toward those who cause harm, while survivors are left navigating inconsistent protection, disbelief, and re-traumatization. Closing these gaps isn't only about improving systems, it's about restoring balance and fairness to the scales of justice. Public reporting on the effectiveness of the STOP-VAWA formula grant program remains limited. No Peace, No Quiet has filed a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request with the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women (OVW) and the Bureau of Justice Statistics (BJS). This request has been classified as complex and may take up to 9 months to process. Once received, the findings will be incorporated into Phase 3 of our research and published for public review. The Law Enforcement Experience Report, published by the National Domestic Violence Hotline in 2022, supports our initial findings but does not provide state-level data. To address this gap, Phase 2 of our work will include a survivor survey focused on state-by-state experiences with law enforcement that will remain open to victims and survivors to use. This survey will use multiple-choice questions to capture consistent, comparable results and document patterns that funding data alone cannot reveal. 9. Next steps and call to action. These next steps will expand the evidence base needed to demand accountability and reform, ensuring that all survivors are treated equally and fairly under the Constitution of the United States of America. Phase 2, Survivor Survey 2025 to 2026, conduct a nationwide state-by-state survivor survey on experiences with law enforcement, collect measurable data to compare survivor outcomes against STOP-VAWA funding use, identify training and reporting gaps that weaken the safety net for victims. Phase 3, FOIA research findings, 2026 to 2027, analyze DOJ and BJS data on STOP-VAWA funding allocation and outcomes. Assess state compliance with the 25% law enforcement and 25% prosecution requirements. Publish findings in a follow-up white paper and share results with Congress, OVW, and state agencies. Ongoing work. Engage advocates, survivors, and legal reform groups to strengthen oversight. Partner with academic institutions and data analysts to build public access maps of compliance. Continue to educate policymakers on why survivor-centered training must be federally enforced, not merely funded. Call to action. Ending violence against women requires more than funding, it requires accountability. Every dollar awarded through the STOP-VAWA formula grant program must result in measurable action that protects survivors and strengthens public trust in the justice system. We call on advocates, allies, and legislators to stand with survivors by demanding transparency in how states use federal funds, enforcing mandatory law enforcement training, and supporting community-based alternatives that put survivor safety first. Join No Peace, No Quiet in this national effort. Participate in our upcoming survivor survey, share your story, and help us push for stronger accountability across all 50 states. Together, we can close the gaps, protect the vulnerable, and ensure that justice works for every survivor, online and offline. Resources to support No Peace, No Quiet's mission, dedicated to creating safe spaces online for victims and survivors of domestic violence and abuse. Download No Peace, No Quiet's Constituent Outreach Kit.